A concrete pillar exploded inches from Luca's face as the sixth attacker swung a crowbar, missing his skull by a heartbeat. The feared Don of the Moretti family was cornered in the rain-flooded garage, his bodyguards dead and his black cashmere coat shredded to reveal the dragon tattoo beneath. Just as the leader raised his weapon for the killing blow, the service door creaked open and a waitress in a stained apron stepped into the bloodbath. The assassins didn't even flinch, dismissing her as a lost girl who had seen too much, but they didn't notice her amber eyes locking onto their positions with military precision. "Get out of here," Luca roared, but Scarlet Reyes didn't move a muscle. She simply calculated the distance to the nearest throat, adjusted her apron, and prepared to show 6 armed men why you never underestimate the help. 2 seconds of thick, suffocating silence stretched out in the damp, oil-slicked air of the garage, broken only by the hum of flickering fluorescent lights overhead. The leader of the hit squad, a hulking brute in a ski mask, let out a rough, barking laugh that echoed off the concrete walls, clearly amused by the interruption. "Look at this," he sneered, turning his back on the wounded Mafia Don to face the girl, his posture relaxing into arrogant confidence. The restaurant sent dessert. He took a heavy step toward her, swinging the crowbar lazily at his side, fully expecting her to scream or faint, yet he had no idea that he was walking toward a woman who had hunted cartel lieutenants in the dust of Juarez. Inside Scarlet's mind, the terrified waitress persona she had worn for 14 months evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold, tactical HUD of an elite operative who had nothing left to lose. She saw the shift in his weight before he moved, saw the fatal opening in his guard, and saw the jagged neck of a broken vodka bottle lying in the trash, canned to her right like a gift from the gods. "Go back inside," Luca shouted again, struggling to push himself up from the wet floor, blood pouring from a gash on his forehead into his eyes. "They will kill you." Scarlet ignored him, her focus narrowing to a singular point of violence. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was so quiet it cut through the garage like a razor blade. "You have 3 seconds to walk away," she said, her tone devoid of fear. The leader didn't walk away. Instead, he lunged, reaching out with a massive hand to grab her throat, intending to snap her neck like a dry twig. That was his last mistake. Scarlet moved like water, fluid and devastating, slipping inside his reach before his brain could register the blur of motion. She grabbed his wrist, used his own momentum to twist his arm behind his back with a sickening crunch, and slammed his face into the concrete pillar with enough force to crack the masonry. The sound of breaking bones sickened the air, and before he could scream, she drove a knee into his solar plexus, dropping him to the oil-stained floor in a convulsing heap. The other 5 men froze, staring at the woman in the cheap black apron, their brains unable to reconcile the image of a service worker with the lethal efficiency they had just witnessed. "She's a pro," one of them screamed, panic cracking his voice as he raised his gun. The garage exploded into chaos as bullets chewed up the pavement where she had been standing a millisecond before. "Stay down," she yelled at Luca, diving behind a parked sedan as the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and concrete dust. For Luca Moretti, the world had turned upside down in the span of a heartbeat. He had spent 10 years running the most powerful family in Chicago, dealing with hitmen, traitors, and rivals, but he had never seen anything like this. The woman he knew only as the quiet bartender who always double-checked his wine order was currently dismantling a professional hit squad with terrifying grace. She popped up from behind the sedan, through a tire iron she had scavenged from the floor with deadly accuracy, and cracked the gunman's wrist, sending his weapon clattering across the floor. She was already moving again, closing the distance to engage 2 men in hand-to-hand combat, fighting with a desperation that suggested she wasn't just fighting for her life, but for something far more important. She fought dirty, using a car door to crush a leg, kicking a handful of gravel to blind an eye, and utilizing the shadows to vanish and reappear where they least expected her. Yet, despite her skill, the numbers were against her. Scarlet was exhausted, her chest heaving as adrenaline burned through her veins, her knuckles bruised and bleeding from the impacts. She dispatched the fourth man with a brutal elbow strike to the temple, but the fifth man, the one standing nearest to the exit, had regained his composure and realized the waitress was the primary threat. He didn't aim at Luca, who was slumped against the wall, too weak from blood loss to be an immediate danger. He aimed at Scarlet, who was exposed in the center of the garage, her back turned as she finished off the fourth attacker. No, Scarlet screamed internally, sensing the shift in the air, but her body was half a second too slow to react. The assassin turned his gun toward her, a cruel smile visible even through the mask, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Goodbye, sweetheart," he whispered, the sound carrying over the ringing silence of the aftermath. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl as Scarlet turned, seeing the dark circle of the gun barrel and knowing she wouldn't make it to cover. She braced herself for the impact, for the burn, for the end of the long, painful road that had started in El Paso. But the impact never came. A dark shape blurred into her vision, moving with the desperate speed of a man who refused to watch another innocent die. Luca Moretti, summoning the last reserves of his strength, threw himself between Scarlet and the gunman. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that signaled the end of the skirmish. The bullet tore through Luca's shoulder, spinning him around, his blood spraying across Scarlet's pristine white work shirt like a gruesome bouquet of roses. He collapsed into her arms, heavy and warm, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a mixture of confusion and intensity that stole her breath. "Why?" Scarlet gasped, her hands immediately pressing against the wound to staunch the flow, her DA training taking over even as her heart shattered at the sight of his blood on her hands. "You don't even know me." Luca looked up at her, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead as shock began to set in. "I know enough," he wheezed, blood bubbling past his lips. "I know you fought for me when my own men died." The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, getting louder by the second, signaling that the real world was crashing back in. The remaining assassin, seeing his window of opportunity closing and his team decimated by a waitress and a dying Dawn, cursed and fled into the night. They were alone. Scarlet cradled the head of the most dangerous man in Chicago, her apron soaked in his blood, realizing with a sinking feeling that her quiet life of hiding was over. She had just saved the devil, and now the devil owed her a life. The harsh, sterile scent of antiseptic was the first thing to hit Scarlet as consciousness clawed its way back, dragging her out of the darkness. She blinked her eyes open, expecting the chaotic noise of a public emergency room or the cramped silence of her own bedroom, but instead, she found herself staring at a ceiling painted with Italian frescoes. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness slammed her back against pillows that felt softer than anything she had ever owned. This wasn't a hospital. The mahogany furniture, the silk drapes blocking the Chicago skyline, and the two massive men standing guard by the door made that terrifyingly clear. She was in the lion's den. Her white shirt, stiff with dried blood that wasn't hers, had been replaced by a clean medical gown, and in 4 drip hummed rhythmically beside the bed. Panic surged through her chest, sharp and immediate, but before she could rip the needle from her arm, the heavy oak door swung open. Markochan walked in, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the room. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like a corporate executioner in a 3-piece suit, his face carved from granite and his eyes devoid of any warmth. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He simply pulled a chair to the side of the bed, though it's scraping against the floor with a sound like a warning shot, and threw a thick manila folder onto her lap. "Scarlet Maria Reyes," he said, his voice flat, reading the name like a death sentence. "Born in El Paso, Texas. Top of your class at Quantico. Special agent with the DEA for 5 years until 18 months ago." He leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You're a long way from the border, agent. And you're a long way from the bartender who barely speaks above a whisper." Scarlet stared at the file, her heart hammering against her ribs as the one secret she had guarded with her life lay exposed in the hands of a Mafia enforcer. "I'm not an agent anymore," Scarlet said, her voice raspy from dehydration, but Marco ignored her, flipping the folder open to a page marked with red tabs. Photographs spilled out across the blanket. Gruesome, grainy crime scene photos that Scarlet saw every time she closed her eyes. Operation Desperado, Marco continued, reciting the details with cruel precision. 3 agents dead. Ambushed. The cartels knew you were coming. The official report says you led them into a trap. Scarlet felt the blood drain from her face. The ghosts of Torres, Kim, and Vasquez seemed to rise in the room, suffocating her. That report is a lie, she hissed, her hands balling into fists. There was a mole. I tried to warn them. They needed a scapegoat to cover up the leak, so they burned me instead. Marco studied her face, looking for a twitch, a lie, anything to confirm she was a threat. A disgraced agent with a dead team. You have every reason to hate men like us. So why save my boss? Why take a bullet for a criminal? Before Scarlet could answer, the door opened again. This time, the guard snapped to attention. Luca Moretti walked in, his left arm in a sling, his face pale against the dark fabric of his shirt, but his presence was undiminished. He moved with a stiff, pained grace, waving Marco away when the younger man tried to help him into a chair. "That's enough, Marco," Luca said, his voice quiet, but laced with an authority that brooked no argument. "Leave us." Marco hesitated, his eyes darting between his boss and the woman he clearly considered an assassin in waiting. "Boss, she's DA. We can't trust a single word she says." Luca didn't look at him. He kept his gray eyes locked on Scarlet. "I said get out." Marco clenched his jaw, shot Scarlet one last look of pure venom, and exited the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind him like the lock of a prison cell. Silence stretched between them, heavy with the scent of medicine and unspoken questions. Lucas studied her, looking at her not as a waitress or a savior, but as a puzzle he needed to solve. "You saved my life twice last night," he said finally, easing himself into the chair Marco had vacated. "Once with your skills and once with your body." "Why?" Scarlet looked away, staring at the 4-line taping her to the bed. "I don't know," she whispered, the truth feeling fragile in the air. "Maybe I'm just tired of watching people die." Luca leaned forward, and for a moment, the mask of the Mafia Don slipped, revealing a man who carried the weight of the world on his injured shoulders. "We are alike then. My father died in my arms 3 years ago. I've been trying to keep this family alive ever since, but someone inside is bleeding us dry." He reached into his jacket pocket, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a second, thinner file. He placed it gently on the bed covers next to the DEA dossier. Scarlet looked down and felt her heart stop. It was a medical file. "Sofia Reyes. You did a background check on me," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. "I do a background check on everyone who enters my world," Luca replied calmly. "Your sister, 22 years old. Selective mutism and severe PTSD after witnessing your mother's suicide. She hasn't spoken a word in 4 years." Scarlet felt tears stinging her eyes, her protective instincts flaring hot and fierce. "Leave her out of this." Luca shook his head. "I can't, because she is the reason you are here. The therapy she needs costs $100,000 a year. You make $3,000 a month pouring drinks. You will never save her on your own." It was a low blow, a cruel, calculated strike at her weakest point. But as Scarlet looked into Luca's eyes, she didn't see malice. She saw desperation. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I need eyes that don't belong to this world," Luca said. "Marco is loyal, but he looks at my men and sees family. You look at them and see targets. I need you to find the traitor who set me up in that garage. Give me 6 months. Find the leak. In exchange, I pay for Sofia's treatment. The best specialists in the country. Full protection." Scarlet looked at the file, at the photo of her sister's terrified, silent face. She thought of the nightmares, the small apartment, the hopelessness that greeted her every morning. Then she looked at Luca, the criminal who was offering her the one thing the justice system never had: hope. 6 months, Scarlet said, her voice hardening. "And if I find him, I walk away. Debt paid." Luca nodded, extending his good hand. "Deal." She took it, and as their skin touched, She knew she had just signed a contract with the devil, but for Sophia, she would have burned the world down. Scarlet's phone buzzed against her thigh, a vibration that felt like a warning shot in the tense silence of the armored Mercedes. She pulled it out, her blood running cold as she read the text from Sophia, a string of terrified emojis followed by a single sentence that shattered her composure. "Someone is outside the door." Scarlet didn't wait for permission. She hammered on the partition glass, separating them from the driver. "Drive faster," she screamed, her voice cracking with a panic she hadn't felt since El Paso. Luca didn't ask questions. He simply leaned forward and barked an order at the driver, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun holstered beneath his jacket. The car surged forward, tearing through the Chicago streets at a speed that blurred the neon lights into streaks of violence. Scarlet sat on the edge of the leather seat, her hands gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. If they touched Sophia, if they hurt a single hair on her sister's head because of a debt Scarlet had incurred, she would burn this entire city to the ground. The apartment building on the south side looked like a tomb against the gray sky, its peeling paint and barred windows a stark contrast to the luxury she had just left. Scarlet was out of the car before it fully stopped, ignoring Marco's shout to wait for cover. She took the stairs 3 at a time, her lungs burning, her weapon drawn, a standard-issue Glock she had kept hidden in a floorboard for emergencies. The door to 4B was ajar. The wood around the lock was splintered, jagged teeth of timber gaping open like a wound. "Sophia!" Scarlet screamed, kicking the door wide and sweeping the room with her gun. The small living room was a wreck. Books were torn from shelves, the sofa was overturned, and the lamps were shattered, glass crunching under her boots as she moved. It wasn't a robbery, it was a message. She checked the kitchen, the bathroom, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird until she reached the bedroom closet. She ripped the door open and collapsed to her knees. Sophia was there, curled into a ball beneath the hanging clothes, her hands pressed over her ears and her eyes squeezed shut. She was shaking so violently her teeth chattered, but she was alive. I'm here," Scarlet whispered, holstering her weapon and pulling her sister into a fierce embrace, rocking her back and forth as Sophia buried her face in Scarlet's neck, silent sobs racking her thin frame. Luca stepped into the room a moment later, his gun lowered, but his eyes scanning every shadow. He saw the sisters on the floor and his expression softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again as he spotted something on the overturned nightstand. "Scarlet," he said, his voice grave. "Look." She followed his gaze and felt the air leave her lungs. Lying on the whitewood was a single black rose, its petals perfect and ominous, tied with a ribbon that bore a handwritten note. "You took ours. We take yours." Russo. Luca spat the name like a curse, his jaw clenching until a muscle ticked beneath the skin. "Victor Russo. He knows you saved me. He knows you matter." Scarlet stood up, pulling Sophia with her, shielding her sister's eyes from the threat. "She has nothing to do with this," Scarlet hissed, fear transmuting into cold, sharp rage. "She is innocent." Luca shook his head, stepping closer, his presence filling the small, violated room. "In my world, innocence is just a target. They won't stop. If you stay here, they will come back tonight, and they won't leave a rose next time." He looked at Sophia, then back to Scarlet, offering the only solution that existed. "Pack a bag. Both of you. You're coming to the estate." Scarlet wanted to argue, wanted to scream that she could protect her own family, but the weight of the gun at her hip felt insignificant against the power of the men who had done this. She nodded once, a sharp, defeated motion. They were refugees now, fleeing into the very fire she had promised to avoid. The Moretti estate was not a home. It was a fortress disguised as a palace. Iron gates twice the height of a man swung open to reveal a sprawling driveway lined with ancient oaks, leading up to a mansion that looked like it had been transported stone by stone from the Italian countryside. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter with Rottweilers, and cameras blinked from every corner, red eyes watching their approach. As the car came to a halt in front of the massive double doors, Scarlet felt Sophia shrink against her side, overwhelmed by the display of wealth and power. "You are safe here," Luca said as the driver opened the door, but Scarlet knew better. Safety was an illusion. They had simply traded a street war for Cold War, moving from the battlefield into the command center. They were ushered into a grand foyer with marble floors that echoed under their feet and a chandelier that dripped crystal tears from a vaulted ceiling. Footsteps clattered down the grand staircase, light and eager, breaking the somber mood. A man appeared, looking so much like Luca that for a second Scarlet thought it was a trick of the light. But where Luca was sharp angles and brooding storms, this man was soft edges and sunlight. "Luca," the man called out, rushing forward to embrace his brother, careful of the injured shoulder. "I heard about the garage. Jesus, are you all right?" This was Dante Moretti. He pulled back, his blue eyes wide with concern, his hands gripping Luca's arms as if to reassure himself that his brother was solid. "I'm fine," Dante, Luca said, his voice warmer than Scarlet had ever heard it. "Thanks to her." Luca turned and gestured to Scarlet, who stood protectively in front of Sophia. Dante's gaze shifted, and a dazzling smile broke across his face, the kind of smile that made politicians and movie stars rich. "The famous bartender," Dante said, stepping forward with his hand extended, his charm radiating like heat from a furnace. "You're the one everyone is whispering about. The woman who took on 6 of Russo's best and walked away." He took Scarlet's hand, not to shake it, but to hold it gently, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture that felt too intimate, too practiced. "Thank you," he said, his voice dropping to a husky register meant to convey deep emotion. "You saved my brother. You saved our family. Anything you need, anything at all, you just ask." Scarlet looked into his eyes that were the exact same shade of gray as Luca's, but lacked the depth, the pain. They were surface-level pools, bright and reflecting only what he wanted her to see. "I just did what I had to do," she replied, pulling her hand back slowly. Her training kicked in, a subtle alarm bell ringing in the back of her skull. He was too perfect, too welcoming. In a world of wolves, the dog that wagged its tail the hardest was usually the one distracting you from the bite. "Welcome to the family, Scarlet," Dante said, beaming at Sophia now. "We're going to take very good care of you." And for the first time that night, Scarlet felt a true shiver of fear crawl down her spine. The thick, gray mist of dawn clung to the Moretti estate like a wet shroud, muting the colors of the manicured rose gardens to ghostly shades of slate and charcoal. Scarlet had been awake since 4 in the morning, her body exhausted, but her mind refusing to shut down, a lingering curse from her years undercover where sleep was a luxury that often got you killed. She moved through the damp grass with silent, practiced steps, her eyes scanning the perimeter fences not because she was on duty, but because she didn't know how to stop being a soldier. Near the central fountain, a woman stood motionless amidst the swirling fog. Donna Maria, the matriarch of the Moretti family, was practicing Tai Chi, her movements slow and fluid, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun that defied the early hour. Scarlet stopped, intending to turn back, but the older woman spoke without breaking her form. "Insomnia is a curse of the vigilant," Donna Maria said, her voice calm and carrying a steel cord that reminded Scarlet instantly of Luca. "Come closer, child. The roses smell best before the sun burns the dew away." Scarlet stepped onto the stone path, feeling a strange sense of kinship with this woman who had buried a husband and raised 2 sons in a world of violence. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Scarlet said softly, keeping her distance out of respect. "You didn't," Donna Maria replied, turning to face her with eyes that were sharp, assessing, and devoid of the fragility one might expect from a grandmother. "My son trusts you. That makes me curious." Trust is a currency Luca does not spend lightly. Before Scarlet could answer, the peace of the morning was shattered. A suppressed thwip-thwip of silenced gunfire cut through the mist, followed by the sickening sound of a bullet chipping marble inches from Donna Maria's head. Scarlet didn't think, she reacted. "Get down," she screamed, launching herself forward and tackling the older woman behind the heavy stone basin of the fountain just as a second volley of bullets chewed up the rosebushes where she had been standing. Adrenaline dumped into Scarlet's system, turning the world into a series of tactical problems and immediate solutions. She peeked around the granite rim and saw 3 figures moving tactically from the east wing fence line, dressed in black tactical gear, moving fast and low toward their position. They weren't common thugs, they were a hit team moving with military coordination, and they had bypassed the outer sensors completely. Scarlet had no weapon on her. The gun she had brought to the estate was locked in her room, and the guards were too far away, their shouts echoing uselessly from the main house. She looked around desperately and her eyes landed on a heavy, long-handled garden shovel leaning against a trellis. It wasn't a firearm, but in the hands of a desperate woman protecting an innocent, it would have to be enough. "Stay here and keep your head down," she ordered Donna Maria, her voice leaving no room for argument. She waited until the lead assassin rounded the hedge, his weapon raised, expecting cowering victims. Scarlet surged up from the mist like a vengeful spirit. She swung the shovel with every ounce of torque her hits could generate, the metal blade slamming into the man's knee with a bone-shattering crunch. He went down screaming, his gun skittering across the wet stones. Scarlet didn't hesitate. She dropped the shovel, dove into a roll, and scooped up his fallen pistol. The second assassin turned, raising his weapon, but Scarlet was faster. She fired 2 rounds center mass, dropping him before he could pull the trigger. The third man hesitated, realizing the ambush had turned into a firefight and that hesitation cost him his life. Scarlet shifted her aim and fired again, the recoil jarring her shoulder, ending the threat with a finality that rang in the sudden silence of the garden. By the time the estate security team swarmed the lawn, weapons drawn and shouting conflicting orders, it was over. Scarlet stood over the neutralized threats, her chest heaving, the stolen gun held low at her side. Luca burst through the patio doors, his face a mask of terrified rage, rushing straight to his mother, who was dusting off her silk trousers with trembling hands. "Mother, are you hurt?" he demanded, checking her for wounds. "I am fine," Luca, Donna Maria said, her voice steady though her face was pale. "Thanks to this girl." She gestured to Scarlet, and for the first time, Scarlet saw genuine respect in the older woman's eyes. But Scarlet wasn't looking at Luca or his mother. Her gaze was locked on the figure sprinting toward them from the west wing of the house. Dante Moretti arrived breathless, his hair disheveled, a pistol in his hand. "Mother, I heard shots. Is everyone okay?" He looked frantic, the picture of a concerned son, scanning the bodies on the ground with wide, panicked eyes. "I was checking the security feeds in the library when I heard it," he gasped, holstering his weapon and moving to hug Donna Maria. "Thank God you're safe." The family huddled together, relieved, but a cold knot of suspicion tightened in Scarlet's stomach. During her tour of the house yesterday, Dante had explicitly told her the library was in the west wing. But the assassins had come from the east fence, a blind spot that had been left curiously unguarded during the shift change. If Dante had been checking security, he would have seen the breach on the monitors instantly. And if he was in the library, he was on the opposite side of the complex, perfectly positioned to be far away from the violence, yet close enough to feign a rescue. Scarlet watched him holding his mother, playing the part of the relieved son to perfection, wiping a tear from his cheek. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar, but Scarlet had spent years watching liars try to save their own skins. He claimed he was watching the feeds, yet the breach came from the one sector that had glitched just minutes before. He arrived from the west, claiming ignorance, while the attack came from the east. The math didn't add up. The coincidence was too precise. Dante Moretti wasn't just the charming brother who welcomed her with a smile. He was the architect of the chaos. As he looked up and caught Scarlet staring at him, his smile faltered for a fraction of a second, the warmth vanishing from his eyes to be replaced by a cold, calculating assessment. In that moment, the suspicion in Scarlet's gut hardened into certainty. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. He was holding the keys. The estate was locked down tight, a hive of kicked-over panic where guards shouted orders and swept the grounds with assault rifles, searching for phantom enemies. But chaos is a ladder for those who know how to climb it, and Scarlet Reyes had spent 5 years climbing out of burning buildings. While Luca and Marco were consumed with securing Donna Maria in the panic room, and Dante was busy playing the role of the traumatized son in the drawing room, Scarlet slipped away. She moved through the service corridors like a ghost, her footsteps swallowed by the thick carpet, her mind replaying the layout she had memorized during her initial tour. The server room was in the basement, a reinforced bunker that held the digital nervous system of the Moretti Empire. 2 guards usually stood watch, but in the frantic aftermath of the assassination attempt, the post was empty, the men drawn away to the perimeter. Scarlet didn't hesitate. She picked the electronic lock with a tension wrench and a shim she had fashioned from a bobby pin, the mechanism yielding with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent hallway. Inside, the air was frigid and smelled of ozone and expensive circuitry. Banks of servers hummed with a low, rhythmic thrumming, the heartbeat of a criminal organization that spanned 3 continents. Scarlet sat at the main terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a muscle memory that had been dormant for too long. She wasn't looking for the live feeds, she was looking for the ghosts. Dante had claimed he was watching the security monitors when the attack happened, which meant his login credentials would still be cached in the active session if he hadn't been careful. He hadn't been. Arrogance, Scarlet whispered, seeing the admin access still blinking on the screen. He thought he was untouchable, thought no one would dare question the brother of the Dawn. She bypassed the live view and dove straight into the archival logs, specifically searching for the glitch that had blinded the East Wing cameras. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a command. A manual override executed at 5:45 a.m., exactly 15 minutes before the shooters breached the fence. And the user ID authorized to execute that command was Dante M. But a timestamp wasn't enough. Luca would never believe his brother was a traitor based on a line of code that could be faked. Scarlet needed a face. She dug deeper, recovering a file that had been deleted from the system 3 days prior. It was a heavy file, fragmented but not overwritten. As the progress bar crawled toward completion, Scarlet's heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of dread. When the video finally popped open, the image was grainy but undeniable. It was recorded in this very room. Dante stood near the door, laughing, a glass of scotch in his hand. He wasn't alone. Standing opposite him was a man Scarlet recognized from the DA's most wanted list, Enzo, the butcher, Ferrari, Victor Russo's top lieutenant. The man rolled up his sleeve to shake Dante's hand, revealing the ink on his forearm, a coiled viper ready to strike, the sigil of the Russo family. They didn't look like enemies negotiating a truce. They looked like partners celebrating a victory. Dante patted the man on the shoulder, handing him a tablet, the security schematics for the estate. Scarlet felt sick, a physical nausea that rolled in her gut. This wasn't just betrayal, it was fratricide on an industrial scale. She quickly pulled up the armory logs as the final nail in the coffin. The rifles the assassins had used in the garden hadn't been brought in from the outside. They had been signed out of the Moretti's own vault 4 hours ago. The authorization signature was Dante's. He had armed the men who came to kill his own mother, likely planning to frame a security lapse on Marco or even Scarlet herself. She plugged in a USB drive she had swiped from the desk and downloaded everything, the video, the logs, the command override. The little metal stick felt heavy in her hand, heavier than any gun she had ever carried. It was a bomb that would blow Luca's world apart. She wasn't just saving him from a bullet anymore, she was about to destroy the only family he had left. As she pulled the drive free and wiped her digital footprints, Scarlet stared at the black screen, realizing the tragedy of it all. Luca was fighting a war to protect his blood, never suspecting that his blood was the weapon pointed at his heart. It was 2 a.m, the hour when the ghosts of the past speak the loudest, and the Moretti estate was buried in a silence so heavy it felt like suffocation. Scarlet stood outside the heavy oak doors of the library, her hand trembling slightly as it hovered over the brass handle, the USB drive in her pocket feeling heavier than a loaded gun. She knew she should go to her room, hide the evidence, and plan her next move with cold detachment, but something pulled her toward him, a magnetic force born of shared trauma and the terrifying realization of what she was about to do to his life. She pushed the door open quietly, slipping inside like a shadow. The room was vast, lined with books that reached the ceiling, illuminated only by the dying embers of a fire in the hearth and a single lamp on the desk. Luca was there, sitting in a high-backed leather chair with a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring into the flames as if searching for answers that had burned away long ago. He didn't look up when she entered, his shoulders slumped in a way the world never saw, stripped of the armor of the dawn, leaving only a man exhausted by the weight of a crown he never wanted. "I thought you are asleep," he said, his voice rough with whiskey and fatigue, yet lacking the sharp edge of command he wore like a shield during the day. Scarlet walked further into the room, the plush Persian rug swallowing the sound of her boots, and stopped a few feet away from him, close enough to smell the scent of sandalwood and old paper that clung to the air. "I can't sleep," she admitted, her voice low in the cavernous space. "The quiet is too loud." Luca swirled the liquid in his glass, watching the light catch the amber depths, a bitter smile touching his lips. "My father used to say that," he murmured, taking a slow sip. "He died in this room, you know. Heart attack, they said. But I think the silence just finally crushed him." He looked up at her then, and the raw vulnerability in his gray eyes took Scarlet's breath away. He wasn't looking at her as an asset or a weapon. He was looking at her as the only other person in the house who understood what it meant to survive when everyone around you was dying. "I see them too," Scarlet said, taking a step closer, drawn into his orbit against her better judgment. "My team, Torres, Kim, Vasquez. Every time I close my eyes, I see the moment the lights went out in their eyes." Luca set the glass down on the small table beside him and stood up, moving toward her with a slow, deliberate grace that made the air between them crackle with static electricity. He stopped inches from her, his gaze tracing the lines of her face as if memorizing a map of a country he wanted to visit but was forbidden to enter. "We are two ghosts haunting the living, Scarlet," he whispered, lifting his hand to gently brush a stray lock of hair from her cheek, his fingers warm and rough against her skin. The touch sent a jolt through her that shattered her defenses, melting the ice around her heart that had been frozen since El Paso. She leaned into his touch involuntarily, her eyes fluttering closed as the barrier between operative and target dissolved into nothing. "I shouldn't be here," she breathed, but she didn't move away. "No," Luca agreed, his thumb tracing her lower lip. "You should run far away from me. I destroy everything I touch." "Maybe I don't want to run," Scarlet replied, opening her eyes to meet his, seeing the hunger and the loneliness warring in his gaze. Luca made a sound low in his throat, a mix of a groan and a plea, and then his mouth was on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was a collision, desperate and searing, fueled by adrenaline and the terrified knowledge that tomorrow might never come. Scarlet wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, needing to feel the solid reality of him against the chaos in her mind. For a few stolen moments, there was no cartel, no traitor, no USB drive burning a hole in her pocket, only the heat of his body and the taste of whiskey on his tongue. When they finally broke apart, breathing heavily, their foreheads rusting against each other, Luca kept his hands cupped around her face, holding her like she was the most precious thing in his breaking world. "I don't trust anyone," Luca whispered, his voice shaking with the weight of the confession, his gray eyes piercing straight into her soul. "Not Marco. Not the captains. Sometimes not even myself. But I trust you, Scarlet." The words hit her harder than a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs and turning her blood to ice. He trusted her. He, a man who had built walls of paranoia around his soul, had let her in. And she was standing there with the evidence that his beloved brother, his own blood, was the one holding the knife to his throat. Guilt washed over her, thick and nauseating, because she knew that when the sun rose, she would have to use that trust to shatter his heart into 1,000 irreparable pieces. "Luca," she started, her voice trembling, wanting to warn him, to soften the blow, but he silenced her with a thumb over her lips. "Don't," he said softly. "Just for tonight, let me believe I'm not alone." And Scarlet, coward and protector all at once, stayed silent, letting him hold her in the dim light of the library, knowing it was the last piece either of them would know for a very long time. The silence following their kiss was a fragile thing, brittle as old parchment, and Scarlet knew she was about to light the match that would burn it to ash. She pulled back from Luca, the warmth of his body still clinging to hers, and saw the confusion cloud his gray eyes, a look of betrayal forming even before she spoke. "I wish I could just be the woman you trust," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the heartbreak of what she had to do. "But I promise to save you, Luca, even if it means you'll hate me." She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the USB drive, and pulled it out, placing it on the mahogany desk between them like a loaded weapon. "The traitor isn't Marco," she said, her voice hardening into professional detachment to mask her pain. "And it isn't one of your captains." Luca looked at the drive, then at her, his brow furrowing as the soft atmosphere of the library evaporated into the cold reality of their dangerous lives. "What is this?" he asked, his tone dropping. "Proof," Scarlet answered, stepping back to give him space. "Watch it." Luca plugged the drive into his laptop, his movements stiff, and clicked on the file Scarlet had recovered from the server room. The video played, grainy, black and white, but unmistakable. Dante standing in the server room, laughing. The Russo lieutenant. The handshake that sealed a pact of blood. The transfer of the security schematics. Scarlet watched Luca's face as the footage played. She expected rage, she expected shouting, but what she saw was far worse. She saw a man dying on the inside. His face went gray, draining of all color until he looked like a corpse, his eyes fixed on the screen as if trying to will the image to change, to be a deep fake, a lie, anything but the truth. When the video ended, the silence in the library was deafening, heavier than the grave. Then, without warning, Luca swept his arm across the desk, sending the laptop, the whiskey glass, and the lamp crashing to the floor in a violent explosion of glass and sparks. "No," he roared, the sound tearing from his throat like a wounded animal. "That is not possible. It's a trick. A fabrication." He rounded the desk, advancing on Scarlet with a fury that would have terrified anyone else, but she stood her ground, meeting his gaze with sad determination. "It's not a trick, Luca," she said softly, refusing to back down. "I pulled the logs myself." Dante authorized the weapons. He disabled the East Wing sensors. He is working with Russo. Luca stopped inches from her face, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with denial. "Dante is my blood," he shouted, shaking his head as if physically trying to dislodge the accusation from his mind. "He held my hand when we buried our father. He swore an oath on our mother's life. He is the only family I have left." He paced away, running a hand through his hair, his composure completely shattered. "You are DA," he spat, turning back to accuse her, desperate for a scapegoat. "You are trained to see enemies in every shadow. You don't understand loyalty. You don't understand brotherhood. You are manipulating this to tear us apart because that is what you do. I am trying to keep you alive." Scarlet countered, her voice rising to matches. "Look at the facts, Luca. The ambush in the garage, the attack on your mother, the blind spots in security, they all lead to him. Why would I lie? I have nothing to gain by hurting you." Luca stared at her, breathing hard, the fight draining out of him as the logic pierced his denial. He looked at the shattered remains of his laptop, then back at the woman he had just kissed. He wanted to believe her, but believing her meant accepting that his entire life was a lie. He needed absolutes. He needed to see the emptiness of the accusation for himself so he could banish this nightmare. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy key card, tossing it onto the desk. "Dante's private office," he said, his voice cold and hollow. "West Wing. Use the code 1984. That's the year he was born." He looked at Scarlet with eyes that were suddenly very old. "Go. Tear it apart. Turn every paper, check every file. And when you find nothing, Scarlet, when you realize you are wrong, you will leave this house and never come back." Scarlet picked up the card, the plastic worm from his pocket, feeling the weight of the ultimatum. "And if I'm right?" she asked quietly. Luca turned his back to her, staring into the dying fire, his silhouette rigid against the glow. "Then I have no brother," he whispered, the words barely audible. "And I am already dead." Scarlet left the library, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her, sealing Luca in with his ghosts. The hallway was dark, the shadows stretching long and distorted against the walls, mimicking the twisted reality she was navigating. She walked toward the west wing, every step heavy with dread. She didn't want to be right. She wanted to walk into that office and find nothing but innocent business papers and family photos. She wanted Luca to scream at her, throw her out, and live happily in his ignorance. But the operative in her knew better. The operative knew that the truth was rarely kind and never convenient. She reached the door to Dante's office, the wood dark and polished, standing like a sentry at the end of the corridor. She swiped the key card, the lock disengaging with a mechanical hum that sounded like the cocking of a gun. She punched in the code 1984, and the handle turned. Scarlet took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay beyond, unaware that she wasn't opening a door to the truth, but stepping directly into the jaws of a trap that had been waiting for her since the moment she arrived. The door to Dante's office swung open with a hush that felt more ominous than a creak, revealing a space that was the polar opposite of Luca's warm, cluttered library. This room was a shrine to sterile ambition, decorated in chrome and black leather, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive cologne, a cold void where a human heart should have been. Scarlet moved quickly, her flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the darkness as she swept the desk, the bookshelves, and the walls, looking for the physical proof that would force Luca to open his eyes. She bypassed the computer, she already had the digital logs, and went straight for the antique globe standing in the corner, a classic hiding spot for men who thought they were clever. She popped the hidden latch along the equator, and the sphere split open to reveal a keypad safe inside. The code for which she gambled was the same as the door. 1-9-8-4. The light turned green, and the heavy door clicked open, spilling its secrets into her hands. Inside wasn't money or gold, but a rolled-up map of Chicago and a stack of contracts drafted on Russo legal stationery. Scarlet unrolled the map on the desk, her breath hitching as she saw the city sliced into red and blue territories, with the Moretti estate circled in black marker and labeled liquidation zone. This was the endgame, a partition treaty that sold out the entire family legacy for a seat at Victor Russo's table. Scarlet reached for her phone to photograph the documents, her hands shaking with a mixture of vindication and terror, but before she could unlock the screen, the room was flooded with blinding, sterile light. She spun around, dropping into a defensive crouch, her hand flying to the small knife she had concealed in her waistband, but she froze before she could draw it. Dante Moretti was sitting in the high-backed chair in the corner of the room, legs crossed, a suppressed pistol resting casually on his knee, and a smile on his face that was terrifyingly serene. "Bravo, Agent Reyes," he said, forcing a slow, mocking clap that echoed off the bare walls. "I must say, you're even better than your file suggested. Most people wouldn't have checked the globe." Scarlet straightened slowly, her muscles coiled like springs, calculating the distance between them, wondering if she could cover the 10 feet before he put a bullet in her chest. "You knew I was coming," she realized aloud, the pieces of the puzzle slamming together in a sickening picture. "You let me find the logs." "I let you find everything," Dante corrected, standing up and walking toward her, keeping the gun leveled at her heart but showing no fear, only the arrogance of a man who held all the aces. "Did you really think a former DEA agent just happens to wander into a Mafia head in a garage? Did you think it was luck that you were the only one there to save my brother?" He laughed, a cold sound that scraped against her nerves. "I orchestrated the garage attack, Scarlet. I hired men who are instructed to wound, not kill, because I needed Luca to owe you his life. I needed him to bring you inside." Scarlet felt the blood drain from her face as the magnitude of the manipulation washed over her. She hadn't been a hero, she had been a pawn from the very first second. Why? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Because Luca is sentimental, Dante sneered, his mask of brotherly love dissolving completely. He would never trust a traitor, but he would trust a savior. I needed someone to lead him to the slaughter, someone he would follow blindly into a trap. And who better than the woman he thinks as his guardian angel? Scarlet's eyes darted to the door, measuring her escape, but Dante saw the shift in her gaze and tooted softly, pulling his phone from his pocket with his free hand. I wouldn't do that if I were you, he warned, turning the screen so she could see the live video feed streaming in high definition. It was a night vision view of a bedroom Scarlet knew intimately, Sophia's room in the guest wing. Her sister was sleeping, her chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm that was violently contradicted by the small, steady red dot dancing on her forehead. I have a sniper positioned in the tree line, and 2 men outside her door, Dante explained, his voice conversational, as if discussing the weather. If I don't send a heartbeat signal every 5 minutes, or if you make a move toward me, they open fire. The first shot takes her leg, the second takes her head. Scarlet froze, the fight draining out of her body as horror replaced adrenaline. She was trapped, checkmated in a game she hadn't even realized she was playing. "You monster," she hissed, tears of impotent rage stinging her eyes. "She has nothing to do with this." Dante shrugged, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "She has everything to do with this. She is the leash that makes you heal." He stepped closer, invading her space, his eyes dead and cold. "Now listen carefully, Scarlet. Because tomorrow night, you're going to help me kill my brother. Willis Tower, 10 o'clock tonight, the Sky Deck." Dante's voice was smooth as polished glass, carrying the terrifying calm of a man who held every card in the deck. He stood in the doorway of his office, the sterile light casting long shadows across his face, outlining the monster beneath the charming brother facade. "You will convince him to go," he continued, his eyes flicking briefly to the phone screen where the live feed of Sophia sleeping remained active, a digital sword of Damocles hanging over Scarlet's head. "You will tell him you found nothing in my office. You will tell him I am innocent. And then you will validate the meeting with Russo as the only way to end this war." Scarlet stood paralyzed, her lungs burning as if she had inhaled smoke. She wanted to lunge at him, to drive her knife into his throat and end the madness, but the red dot dancing on her sister's forehead froze her blood. "If you try to warn him," Dante added, stepping closer until she could smell his expensive cologne, "if you write a note, blink a code, or even look at him the wrong way, the sniper fires. Do we understand each other, Agent Reyes?" Scarlet swallowed the bile rising in her throat and nodded, a sharp, jerky motion that marked the death of her integrity. She stumbled out of the West Wing, her legs feeling like lead, carrying the weight of a secret that was already suffocating her. The night passed in a blur of agonizing consciousness. Scarlet sat at the foot of her bed in the dark, watching the rise and fall of her sister's chest in the next room, terrified that if she blinked, the rhythm would stop. Every creak of the old house sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle of the wind sounded like an assassin's footstep. She was trapped in a panopticon, stripped of her agency, reduced to a puppet on a string held by a fratricidal psychopath. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky over Lake Michigan in cruel shades of pink and gold, it didn't bring relief. It brought the deadline. Scarlet forced herself to shower, to dress in her armor of black clothes, and to paint a mask of composure over her shattered features. Walking into the breakfast room felt like walking to the gallows. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries, usually comforting, turned her stomach. Luca was already there, sitting at the head of the table, sipping espresso. He looked up when she entered, and the raw hope warring with fear in his gray eyes nearly brought her to her knees. He looked tired, a man who had spent the night wrestling with the possibility that his own blood wanted him dead. "Well," Luca asked, his voice tight. "Did you go? Did you find it?" This was the moment. The pivot point where she could save his soul or save her sister's life. Scarlet dug her fingernails into her palms until the skin broke, the sharp pain grounding her in the nightmare. She looked at Dante, who was sitting opposite Luca, buttering a piece of toast with a relaxed, easy smile, his eyes daring her to speak. She looked at Sophia, who was quietly eating her fruit, oblivious to the crosshairs painted on her future. Scarlet's heart shattered. "I was wrong," she lied, the words tasting like ash and iron in her mouth. "I checked the office, Luca. I checked everything. The globe, the safe, the files. It was clean." She forced herself to meet Luca's gaze, praying he wouldn't see the terror screaming behind her eyes. There were no maps, no contracts with Russo, just old family photos and business ledgers. I let my paranoia get the best of me. Relief washed over Luca's face, so profound and physical that he slumped back in his chair, letting out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. "I knew it," he whispered, closing his eyes for a second. "Thank God." "I told you, brother," Dante said softly, leaning forward to place a reassuring hand on Luca's forearm, playing the role of the forgiving saint to perfection. "This war, it makes us see enemies where there are only family. But we can end it. Today." He paused, letting the silence build before dropping the bait. "Russo reached out to me this morning. He knows we're strong. He wants to sit down. Neutral ground. Willis Tower. He says he's ready to negotiate a ceasefire." Luca hesitated, his instincts, honed by years of survival, flaring up. "Russo doesn't negotiate," he muttered, frowning. "He shoots." He turned to Scarlet, seeking the counsel of the woman he trusted above all others, the woman he believed had just cleared his brother's name. "What do you think, Scarlet? Does it feel right?" It was a cruel test, a final twist of the knife. Scarlet felt Dante's gaze boring into the side of her head, felt the phantom weight of the sniper's trigger finger. "I think you should go," she said, her voice hollow, driving the final nail into the coffin of Luca's trust. "If Dante says it's safe, it's safe. You need to end this war, Luca, before anyone else gets hurt." Luca nodded slowly, accepting her judgment as gospel. "Okay," he said, the decision made. "Set it up. Tonight, 10 p.m. He reached out and squeezed Scarlet's hand, his grip warm and firm, a gesture of gratitude that felt like a brand searing her skin. "Thank you," he said softly, "for proving me wrong. For giving me my brother back." He stood up and left the room to prepare for the meeting that was designed to be his execution. Dante watched him go, then turned his attention back to his breakfast. He didn't say a word to Scarlet. He didn't need to. He simply picked up his coffee cup and winked at her, a slow, conspiratorial gesture that sealed their unholy alliance. Scarlet sat frozen, staring at her plate, realizing with a sinking feeling that she was no longer just a witness to the crime. She was the weapon. The rest of the morning dragged by in a suffocating haze of paranoia, with every servant looking like a spy and every shadow stretching into the shape of a gunman. Scarlet moved through the house with the stiff, mechanical motions of a prisoner, conscious of the cameras blinking their red, unblinking eyes from the vaulted ceilings. She needed Marco, but talking to him openly was a death sentence for Sophia. Dante would see it, misinterpret it, and send the kill signal before she could utter a single word of defense. Her opportunity came just after lunch when she spotted Luca's right hand walking down the east corridor, reviewing duty rosters on a tablet. Scarlet seized a silver pitcher of iced water from a passing service cart, took a deep breath to steady her shaking hands, and orchestrated her own clumsiness. She rounded the corner and collided hard with Marco, the pitcher clattering to the floor and soaking the front of his expensive suit in freezing water. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, dropping to her knees to gather the ice, using the chaotic moment to press a tightly folded scrap of paper into his wet palm. "I wasn't looking." Marco's hand closed instantly over the note, his face a mask of stone that gave nothing away. "Watch where you're going," he snapped for the benefit of the cameras, but his eyes held a flicker of understanding. He marched off toward the service quarters, leaving Scarlet kneeling in the puddle, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The laundry room in the sub-basement was the only place in the estate that felt real, a humid, noisy sanctuary filled with the roar of industrial washers and the scent of bleach that burned the nostrils. It was also, according to the schematic Scarlet had seen in the server room, the only blind spot in Dante's digital panopticon. She waited behind a rack of drying linens, counting the seconds, terrified that Dante had intercepted the message, that the next person to walk through the door would be an assassin. But when the heavy steel door creaked open, it was Marco. He locked it behind him and turned to her, the annoyance gone from his face, replaced by a grim, lethal intensity. "You have 2 minutes," he said, his voice barely audible over the thrum of the machines. "If Dante's suspects were conspiring, we're both dead." Scarlet didn't waste time with pleasantries. "He has Sophia," she whispered, the words rushing out in a torrent. "A sniper is watching her room. He forced me to lie to Luca. The meeting at Willis Tower is a trap. Russo and Dante are going to kill him tonight." Marco didn't look surprised. He looked resigned, as if she had just confirmed a cancer diagnosis he had long suspected. He leaned against a vibrating dryer, crossing his arms over his chest. "I knew it," he muttered, closing his eyes for a brief second. "I've known for months that Dante was rotting from the inside, but I couldn't prove it without getting Luca killed." He looked at Scarlet, his dark eyes sharp and assessing. "The sniper changes everything. If we move on Dante now, he gives the order, and your sister dies. We can't stop the meeting." Scarlet felt the blood drain from her face. "So we just let him walk into an execution?" Marco shook his head, a cold, predatory smile touching his lips. "No. We let Dante think he's won. We let him bring Luca to the tower. We let him gather all his conspirators in one room." He stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "I have a team. 12 men, loyal only to me and the memory of Don Enzo. We will be at the tower tonight. We can't touch the sniper here without triggering an alarm, but we can control the environment there." The moment Dante reveals himself, Marco continued, outlining the desperate gambit. "I cut the power to the sky deck. In the darkness, the playing field is even. My team breaches. You get Luke out. I take care of Dante." It was a plan built on razor-thin margins, a suicide mission disguised as a rescue op. "What about Sophia?" Scarlet asked, her voice trembling. "If Dante realizes it's a trap." Marco's expression softened, just a fraction. "The moment the lights go out in Chicago, the signal to the sniper cuts. He's using a heartbeat monitor on his phone to keep the shooter standing down, isn't he?" Scarlet nodded, realizing Marco knew the tech better than she did. "When the signal is lost, standard protocol is to hold fire and wait for visual confirmation. I'll have a second team ready to breach your sister's room the second the network goes dark. It's risky, Scarlet. I won't lie to you. But it's the only way to save them both." They stood there for a moment in the humid roar of the laundry room, 2 soldiers from different wars united by a common enemy. Scarlet looked at Marco, seeing not the Mafia enforcer she had feared, but a man of honor bound by a code that Dante had long ago abandoned. "Make sure your men are ready," she said, her voice hardening with resolve. "Because once we step into that tower, there's no coming back." Marco nodded, unlocking the door. "Go," he ordered. "Keep playing the scared little traitor. Make Dante believe he owns you. Tonight, we remind him that loyalty is stronger than blood." Scarlet slipped out of the room, leaving the noise and the heat behind, ascending back into the cold, silent mansion where she would have to wear her mask for a few more hours. The die was cast. Tonight, Chicago would burn, and she would either walk out of the ashes with her family, or she would burn with them. The armored Mercedes sliced through the rain-slicked streets of downtown Chicago like a shark moving through dark water, the silence inside the cabin heavy enough to crush bone. Scarlet sat next to Luca in the back seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide the tremors that threatened to give her away. Every passing street lamp cast a rhythmic, flashing light across Luca's face, illuminating the sharp angles of his jaw and the weary hope in his eyes that made Scarlet feel physically ill. She was Judas in a black coat, sitting beside the man she was delivering to his executioners, praying that Marco's desperate plan wouldn't result in a massacre. The tiny earpiece deep in her ear canal remained silent, a void of static that offered no comfort, only the terrifying reminder that she was operating without a net. "You're quiet tonight," Luca said, his voice low and intimate, breaking the oppressive stillness. He reached out and covered her cold hands with his warm one, a gesture of comfort that felt like a brand searing her skin. "Are you afraid?" "I'm always afraid," Scarlet answered, the truth slipping out wrapped in a lie. "Russo isn't a man who negotiates. I just want this to be over." Luca turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers, his grip firm and grounding. "It will be," he promised, looking out the window at the passing skyline of the city he ruled but didn't own. "After tonight, everything changes. I've been moving assets for months, Scarlet. Hotels, legitimate real estate, clean tech. Once we sign this truce with Russo, I'm out." He turned back to her, his gray eyes shining with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "No more looking over my shoulder. No more blood. I want a life where I don't have to wonder if the person sitting next to me is going to kill me." The irony was a knife twisting in Scarlet's gut. He was confessing his dream of freedom to the woman who was currently holding the gun to his head. "You deserve that life," she whispered, fighting the urge to scream the truth, to tell him to turn the car around and run. "We both do." The car pulled up to the service entrance of Willis Tower, the skyscraper piercing the cloud layer like a needle of black glass. The loading dock was empty, cleared of all personnel, a vacuum of silence that screamed trap to anyone with tactical training. Luca didn't seem to notice. He was too focused on the promise of peace waiting at the top. They were ushered into the freight elevator by two of Dante's men, stone-faced guards who didn't make eye contact. The ascent was a dizzying rush, the floor numbers flickering past on the digital display like a countdown to detonation: 50, 70, 90. Scarlet's ears popped as the pressure changed, the sensation mirroring the pressure building behind her eyes. She checked her watch. 9:58 p.m. Marco's team should be in position on the lower floors, rigging the breakers, but there was no signal, no confirmation. Just the hum of the elevator and the beating of her own traitorous heart. The doors slid open on the 103rd floor with a soft chime that sounded like a funeral bell. The sky deck was a cavernous space of shadows and glass, the city of Chicago spread out below them like a glittering carpet of diamonds, a million miles away from the violence about to unfold. Standing in the center of the observation deck, framed by the infinite darkness of the night sky, waited two figures. Dante Moretti stood with his hands in his pockets, wearing a smile that didn't reach his predatory eyes. Beside him sat Victor Russo, the old lion of the rival family, looking frail but venomous in a wheelchair, surrounded by 6 armed guards who blended into the shadows. "Brother," Dante called out, his voice echoing off the glass walls, warm and welcoming. "You made it." Luca stepped out of the elevator, his hand still holding Scarlet's, pulling her with him into the center of the web. "Let's get this done," Luca said, his voice steady. "I want peace." Dante's smile widened, sharp and cruel. "Peace is a lovely dream, Luca," he replied, glancing at Scarlet with a look of triumph. "But history is written by the winners." The elevator doors closed behind them, sealing them in the glass cage, and the trap snapped shut. The 103rd floor of Willis Tower felt less like an observation deck and more like an altar built for a ritual sacrifice, suspended in the void above the glittering grid of Chicago. Dante Moretti paced in front of the glass walls, his silhouette framed by the city lights, looking at Luca with a mixture of pity and contempt that cut deeper than any knife. "You always wanted to stand above it all, didn't you, brother?" Dante asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You wanted to turn our family into something respectable. Real estate. Tech clean money." He laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "But you forgot what we are. We are wolves, Luca. And wolves don't wear sheep's clothing without starving to death." Luca stood rigid, his hand still gripping Scarlet's, his face a mask of stone. "I did it for us," he said quietly. "So we wouldn't end up like father, dead at 50 with a heart full of stress and a liver full of scotch." Dante stopped pacing and turned, his face twisting into a snarl. "Father didn't die of stress. He died because he was weak, just like you." Victor Russo cleared his throat, the sound wet and impatient, tapping his fingers against the armrest of his wheelchair. "Enough family therapy," the old Don rasped, signaling his 6 guards who stepped out of the shadows, weapons raised. "Finish it, Dante. Take the territory. Take the crown." Dante nodded, pulling a gun from his jacket, but he didn't aim at Luca. He aimed at Scarlet. "Before you die, brother, you should know who you're holding hands with," Dante sneered, enjoying the revelation. "She isn't a bartender. She isn't a scared civilian. Meet Special Agent Scarlet Reyes, formerly of the DA." He watched Luca's face, waiting for the devastation, and he got it. Luca went still, his grip on Scarlet's hand loosening as if he had been burned. He looked at her, searching her eyes for a denial, but found only tears and the hard, cold truth. "Is it true?" he whispered, the betrayal breaking his voice. "Yes," Scarlet choked out, unable to lie to him anymore. "But I never." Dante cut her off. "She was sent to hunt us, Luca. And I used her to bring you here. Poetic, isn't it?" Dante snapped his fingers and a side door opened. Two thugs dragged a terrified figure into the room, Sophia. She was bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror, tears streaming down her face. "I brought insurance," Dante said, aiming his gun at the girl's head, just in case Agent Reyes decided to be a hero. Scarlet lunged forward, a primal scream tearing from her throat, but the guards racked the slides of their rifles, freezing her in place. "On your knees," Dante roared, the playful facade gone. "Both of you, or the girl dies first." Luca looked at Scarlet, then at Sophia, and slowly sank to his knees on the glass floor. Scarlet followed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The end. Dante raised his gun, pointing it squarely between Luca's eyes. "Goodbye, brother," he whispered. "Say hello to father for me." Then the world went black. The lights of the sky deck died instantly, plunging the room into absolute, suffocating darkness. The hum of the ventilation system cut out, leaving a ringing silence that lasted for a fraction of a second before chaos erupted. "Hold fire," Dante screamed in the dark, panic threading his voice. "I can't see." But Scarlet didn't need to see. For 14 months she had been a waitress, but for 5 years she had been a weapon forged in the dark. She moved before the echo of Dante's voice faded, guided by memory and instinct. She swept Luca's legs, knocking him flat to the glass just as the first panic-fire bullets chewed through the air where his head had been. "Stay down," she hissed, rolling away from him, moving toward the sound of Sophia's muffled whimpers. The room exploded into a strobe-light nightmare as muzzle flashes lit up the dark in terrifying bursts. Marco's team had breached the stairwell doors, their suppressed rifles coughing rhythmically, taking down Dante's confused guards with surgical precision. Scarlet reached Sophia, shielding her sister's body with her own, slicing the ropes with the knife she had kept hidden in her boot. "Run to the elevator," Scarlet ordered, shoving Sophia toward the wall. "Stay low." Amidst the flashing lights and flying glass, she saw Dante scrambling backward, firing blindly into the dark, his face a mask of terror. He wasn't a wolf anymore. He was a cornered rat. Luca was moving too, not running away, but advancing through the gunfire toward his brother. The glass walls of the tower shattered under the stray bullets, letting the howling wind and rain of the Chicago night scream into the room, turning the sky deck into a hurricane of noise and violence. "Dante!" Luca roared over the wind, a demon rising from the floor. Dante saw him, scrambled to his feet, and bolted toward the emergency exit to the roof, abandoning his allies, his plan, and his dignity. The trap had sprung, but the prey had teeth. The heavy steel door to the roof slammed open, banging against the concrete wall like a gunshot as Luca burst out into the freezing Chicago night. The wind-up here was a physical force, a howling beast that tore at his clothes and threatened to push him off the edge of the world, carrying with it a blinding slurry of snow and ice. Dante was 20 feet away, stumbling near the helipad, his silhouette jagged and desperate against the glow of the city lights far below. He looked back, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred, stripped of the charming veneer he had worn for 30 years. It didn't have to end like this. Luca screamed over the gale, stepping onto the slick surface, his hands raised not in surrender, but in a final plea. "We are blood, Dante. Stop running." But Dante didn't stop. He turned, reaching into his coat, not for a gun. He had lost that in the fight below, but for a long, serrated hunting knife that glinted wickedly in the strobe lights of the radio towers. Blood? Dante laughed, the sound snatched away by the wind. You poisoned our blood the day you decided to turn us into businessmen. You made us weak, Luca. You made us prey. Dante charged, closing the distance with the feral intensity of an animal backed into a corner. Luca braced himself, slipping on the icy mesh of the walkway, and barely managed to catch Dante's wrist as the knife slashed toward his throat. They collided with a brutal thud, grappling on the edge of the abyss, feet scrambling for traction on the frozen metal. This wasn't a fight for territory or money, it was a fratricidal brawl fueled by a lifetime of hidden resentments. Dante headbutted him, the impact shattering Luca's nose and filling his mouth with the copper taste of blood, but Luca didn't let go. He twisted his brother's arm, forcing them both down onto the hard, unforgiving surface of the roof. I did it to save us, Luca grunted, driving a knee into Dante's ribs. To keep you out of prison. To keep you alive. Dante spat in his face, thrashing wildly. You didn't save us, he hissed, his eyes wide and manic. You neutered us. Father built a kingdom of fear, and he wanted to turn it into a country club. I was the only one willing to do what was necessary to keep the crown. With a surge of hysterical strength, Dante freed his knife hand and slashed wildly, the blade tearing through Luca's jacket and biting deep into his forearm. Pain flared hot and white, but it clarified Luca's mind. He realized then that the brother he loved, the boy he had protected on the playground, died a long time ago, replaced by this bitter, ambitious stranger. Luca ignored the wound, blocked the next strike, and delivered a devastating right hook to Dante's jaw. Dante's head snapped back, and the knife clattered away across the ice. Luca straddled him, his hands finding purchase on the lapels of Dante's coat, shaking him violently. I could kill you right now, Luca roared, staring down into the eyes that mirrored his own. I should kill you. Dante grinned through bloody teeth, a rictus of defiance. Do it, he taunted. Prove you're a Moretti. Prove you have the stomach for it. Luca's fingers tightened around Dante's throat, the rage pulsing in his veins demanding retribution for the betrayal, for Scarlet, for Sophia. It would be so easy. Just a little pressure, a few minutes of darkness, and the threat would be gone. But as he looked at Dante's face, turning purple in the cold light, he saw the trap for what it truly was. Killing Dante wouldn't save the family, it would destroy Luca's soul, turning him into the very monster his brother wanted him to be. He released his grip, shoving Dante back into the snow with a cry of frustration. No, Luca gasped, standing up and backing away, his chest heaving. That's what you want. You want to drag me down into the mud with you. I won't do it. You don't get to turn me into a killer. Dante coughed, massaging his throat, looking up at Luca with confusion that quickly curdled back into hate. Then you're a coward, Dante whispered. And cowards don't survive. Before Dante could move, the roar of rotors drowned out the wind. A beam of blinding white light cut through the snow, pinning Dante to the roof like an insect under a microscope. A black helicopter bearing the Moretti crest hovered overhead, descending rapidly. The side door slid open, and two armed security officers jumped out, weapons trained on the prone traitor. But it wasn't the guards that made Dante flinch, it was the woman who stepped out behind them. Donna Maria walked across the icy roof with the stability of a woman walking to church, her black coat whipping around her legs, her face a mask of tragic resolve. She looked at Luca, bleeding and shivering, and then at Dante, who reached out a hand toward her, seeking salvation. Mother, Dante pleaded, his voice cracking. He tried to kill me. You have to help me. Donna Maria stopped just out of his reach. She looked down at the son she had birthed, seeing the stranger he had become. I helped you, she said, her voice carrying over the storm. I helped you by hiding your cruelty when you were a child. I helped you by making excuses for your jealousy. But I will not help you destroy this family. She signaled to the guards. Take him. As they dragged Dante away, screaming and kicking, Luca stood alone in the cold, watching the only blood he had left disappear into the dark, realizing that sometimes amputation is the only way to save the body. 2 years later, the morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Moretti Reyes Community Center, bathing the training mats in a warm, golden light that felt a world away from the neon flicker of a parking garage. Scarlet moved through the rows of women, adjusting a stance here, correcting a grip there, her voice ringing out with clear, calm authority. She wasn't barking orders like a drill sergeant. She was guiding them, teaching 15 survivors of domestic violence how to turn their fear into a weapon. The goal isn't to hurt him, she told a young woman with a healing bruise on her cheek. The goal is to create space. To buy the 3 seconds you need to run. Scarlet wiped sweat from her forehead, realizing with a sudden, sharp clarity that she hadn't had a nightmare in 6 months. The ghosts of El Paso were still there, faint echoes in the back of her mind, but they no longer screamed. They simply watched, nodding in silent approval at the work she was doing. She wasn't hiding behind an apron or a badge anymore. She was just Scarlet, and for the first time in her life, that was enough. From the observation deck above, Luca Moretti watched his wife work, a small smile softening the lines around his eyes. He looked different now. The jagged tension that used to vibrate off him like heat from a pavement was gone, replaced by the steady confidence of a man who no longer had to look over his shoulder. The Moretti family was completely legitimate now, owning a portfolio of luxury hotels and tech startups that generated clean money and zero bodies. It hadn't been easy. Dismantling a criminal empire was like defusing a bomb while running a marathon, but with Marco's logistics and Scarlet's tactical mind, they had done it. Dante was serving 3 consecutive life sentences in a supermax facility in Colorado, a king without a kingdom, screaming at concrete walls. Sophia was finishing her sophomore year at Northwestern, studying psychology, her voice, once stolen by trauma, now one of the loudest in her debate club. And Donna Maria was finally sleeping through the night, ruling over her garden instead of a crime family. The class ended, and as the women filed out, chatting and laughing, Luca walked down the stairs, carrying a bundle wrapped in soft pink wool. Scarlet looked up, her face lighting up with a radiance that stole the breath from his lungs. "Did she sleep?" Scarlet asked, walking over to take their 6-month-old daughter, Elena, into her arms. "Like a rock," Luca replied, kissing Scarlet on the forehead, lingering there to breathe in her scent of jasmine and hard work. "She has your stubbornness." Scarlet laughed, rocking the baby who blinked open eyes that were the exact same shade of gray as her father's. "She has your eyes, Luca. God help us." They stood there in the center of the gym, surrounded by the peace they had fought so hard to build. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still days when Luca woke up reaching for a gun that wasn't there, and days when Scarlet scanned a room for exits before she said hello. But those were just scars, and scars were proof that the wound had closed. "Do you ever regret it?" Luca asked quietly, his hand resting on the small of her back, watching the dust motes dance in the light. "Walking into that garage? Saving a monster?" Scarlet looked at him, then down at the daughter who would never know the sound of a silenced pistol or the smell of a holding cell. "I didn't save a monster," she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I saved a man who was lost in the dark. And he saved me right back." She looked out at the city skyline, which no longer looked like a battlefield, but like a home. "Family isn't about whose blood runs in your veins, Luca. It's about who bleeds for you. It's about who stands beside you when the lights go out." They had walked through the fire, through betrayal, and through the wreckage of their pasts to find this moment of quiet. And as Elena cooed softly in her sleep, Scarlet knew that every bullet, every lie, and every tear had been the price of admission for this perfect, fragile happiness. This story reminds us that redemption is not a destination, but a choice we make every single day. It teaches us that while we cannot change where we come from or the blood that runs through our veins, we have the absolute power to choose who we become. Luca chose to break a cycle of violence that had spanned generations, proving that true strength isn't about how many enemies you can destroy, but about how many loved ones you can protect. Scarlet showed us that our past traumas do not define our future worth, and that sometimes, The things that break us are the very things that forge us into the people we need to be. Thank you so much for journeying with us through the shadows and the light of the Moretti family. Here at Sunni Romance, we believe that love is the most powerful force for change in the world, even in the darkest of places. We want to hear from you. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between loyalty to your history and loyalty to your future? Or has there been a person in your life who saw the best in you when you only saw the worst? Please share your thoughts and your stories in the comments below. We read every single one and cherish the community we are building together. If this story touched your heart, please like the video and subscribe to Sunni Romance for more emotional, gripping tales of love and survival. Until next time, remember that even the deepest wounds can heal and that you are never, ever alone in your fight. Goodbye for now.